Hey, everybody, welcome to Red May, your 1 month vacation from capitalism. And we are at the end of the month. Today, we have our last event Ukraine, imperialism, and the world economy. There are no events to preview, so I will just go straight to the pitch and say if you want to see this again next year, which would be our 7th year, we need some donations because we don't have any institutional support. So go to www.redmayseattle.org. And if you like what we do, press the donate button. We have a Patreon. You can become a patron of Red May, or you can do a one-time donation at our GoFundMe, Fan the Flames of Red May. Today we have, I'm very happy to be working again with Spectre Journal, who put together a wonderful panel on the Paris Commune last year. Spectre is a relatively new journal. I think they're on their 5th or 6th issue, and I highly recommend it for in-depth analysis from a left point of view as to what's going on in the world. We're lucky to have one of the members of the editorial board, David McNally, here. David McNally teaches in the Department of History at the University of Houston, but you might know him for any of his many books. Global Slump Against the Market, that's one of my personal favorites. Monsters of the Market, Zombies, Vampires, and Global Capitalism. And his most recent book, Blood and Money, War, Slavery, Finance, and Empire. David, welcome back to Red May. And you're on the mute, so that's the other thing we didn't cover. Click off the mute button.
Thank you very much, Philip, and let me echo your important plug for Red May. We're living at a time in which the radical and socialist left needs all the forums available to us for popular education, for discussion and debate, and Red May has become really one of the key venues for those discussions. So I too endorse very strongly the call to contribute, keep it afloat, keep it financially viable. As Philip said, I'm one of the editors of Spectre Journal, and one of the tasks that we've set ourselves as a journal is to avoid mere repetition of formulas from the past and to be aware that the world in which we live, which is a world of multiple crises, ecological, political, environmental, social, military, that this world of crises has also been one in which too often left voices have been marginalized and really unable to make themselves central to events. Crucial here is the war in Ukraine. And one of the things which really has not received the attention that it deserves is the overall dynamics of imperialism and world economy in the context of the war in the Ukraine. Many of us are aware that global finance has been incredibly weaponized throughout this war, but it still is a dimension that lacks the degree of analysis and analytical clarity that we could use. So we've brought together a terrific collection of speakers today, and I will introduce them in the order in which they'll be speaking to you, and then I will call on them in succession as we get into the actual presentations. They will be followed by a period of time in which I will check the comments for questions or ideas to be discussed by our speakers, and also I may raise the odd issue of my own in the course of the discussion. So we'll be hearing first from Ilya Matveev. Ilya is a researcher and activist from Russia. He'll be followed by Zakhar Popovich. Zakhar Popovich is a co-founder of Socialny Ruch and is a PhD in economics. Our final speaker will be Rebecca Karl. Rebecca teaches history at NYU in New York, and her most recent book, published by Verso in 2020, is China's Revolutions in the Modern World, A Brief Interpretive History. I should also say that Zakhar has very graciously agreed to come in at the last minute to substitute for Yuliya Yurchenko, who could not be here at the last minute. And so we really send a shout out to Zakhar for his willingness to support this panel. So that is the order in which we'll hear from our three wonderful speakers. And Ilya, I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be able to share my thoughts today. And I have prepared a little presentation, if it can be shown. Thank you so much. So it's really just 3 slides, but it's my academic habit. So Ukrainian invasion and the blockification of the global economy. There is a constant theme on Russian TV, this propaganda theme that the world crisis is coming, that the West that is sanctioning Russia right now is destroying itself, is destroying the global economy by these unprecedented sanctions that essentially will backfire and plunge the world into catastrophe. And this is one of the examples. So Vyacheslav Volodin, who is the Speaker of the Russian Parliament, said that it says, name those responsible for the coming global Holodomor. So, of course, it's not Russia that is responsible for this Holodomor, for this famine, but America and the West that supposedly, restrict access to grain and create world hunger. So this is just a constant thing on Russian TV. And clearly, it is an extreme misrepresentation of what's going on. And also, it is an extreme exaggeration. So I think that despite the fact that sanctions against Russia are truly unprecedented, despite this fact, this will not be a truly, world-changing event in terms of the economy, because Russia accounts for less than 2% of the global GDP. So every product that Russia exports can be replaced eventually, even natural gas, even oil, even wheat, everything. So Russia is not a huge economic player in the world. And this is why I do not think that all this propaganda, all those slogans that the West creates the crisis by isolating Russia. So I don't think it's true, right? Another important thing is that there is this issue of wheat and agriculture, and there is an often repeated claim that Russia and Ukraine together account for 25% of global wheat exports. And so they're truly important in agricultural exports. But what is not mentioned here is that exports of wheat are actually just 1% of the wheat production across the world. So 99% of bread that is produced across the world is produced domestically. And the exports do not play such a big role in this particular product. So I don't think that this particular crisis, this war, will lead to some world historic changes in terms of the economic order. But I do think that something is happening. So this is just a collection of interesting headlines and events that I prepared. So Guardian reported that China orders a stress test of its economy because Chinese officials fear Russia-style sanctions. So China is now actively preparing for the same set of sanctions that was implemented against Russia. So the second thing is that a huge Chinese oil company is exiting from all of its American investments. So it is selling all of its American assets. Again, because Chinese officials fear that the US will seize their assets, their American assets, and so now they try to sell them to anticipate this this possibility. So foreign investors are leaving China. They leave China because of extremely harsh COVID restrictions in China right now, but also because of this general fracturing of this economic relationship between China and the United States, right? Then there is an interesting report by Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, and she said that the United States needs to favor friendshoring of supply chains. So it's an interesting new concept that offshoring needs to be replaced with friendshoring, with supply chains that only traverse countries that are united in one geopolitical bloc. And so, for instance, by this logic, American companies need to move production away from China to other countries, to countries that are friendly to the United States. And finally, Kristalina Georgieva, a managing director of the IMF, said that the pandemic and war lead to the fragmentation of the world economy into geopolitical blocs. So this is the reality that is now recognized by the IMF itself. And I think it's a very significant development. So what will this coming world order look like? I think that the most important process right now, perhaps the most important global process, is this fracturing of economic ties between the United States and China. So American leadership decided that this previously existing relationship between America and China is no longer sustainable. So it is not useful for the United States anymore. So it does not bring benefits for the United States. So it needs to be revised, and because of this, there is now a confrontation, a standoff between America and China, and so it will lead to dramatic rearrangement of geopolitics of the world order, right? And Russia's invasion of Ukraine accelerates, in fact, this process, accelerates the blockification of the global economy. So this invasion forces China to defend itself from this weaponization of economic ties that David has already mentioned. The invasion itself might not lead to this, global changes, but it certainly accelerates the changes that are already happening. This division of the world into geopolitical and geoeconomic blocks, instead of this globalized world in which the United States is a complete hegemon. So it is a world in which you have probably two big economic blocks, the Western bloc and the Chinese bloc, that includes Russia as a junior partner, in fact, because Russian economy is maybe 10 times, 15 times weaker than Chinese economy. So, but then there are also independent players like Turkey that are able to, play into both camps, somehow exploit these divisions and benefit from them. So it is something like a multipolar world order that, again, Russian propaganda wants so much for some reason. But then in this particular order, Russia is in fact a weak player. So Russian invasion accelerates the emergence of this multipolar order, but Russian position in this order is quite bad, and it's clear from the results of sanctions, from the effects of sanctions, from the effects of the war itself, that Russian position in the world is dramatically weakened. But overall, I think that it's fair to say that we're heading into something like pre-First World War imperialism. So the world is divided between imperialist powers, and there are political divisions, and then there are economic divisions that overlap these political divisions. And this sets the stage, unfortunately, for even bigger conflicts to come, conflicts even bigger than the war between Russia and Ukraine. So this is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilya. I look forward to coming back to some of these points in our discussion period. I'll now turn the floor over to Zakhar Popovich, who, as I say, we really appreciate stepping in at the last minute on behalf of Yuliya Yurchenko.
Yes, thank you very much, David. Yes, unfortunately, Yuliya, who is the coordinator of the project for canceling of Ukrainian debt, and she is really the best person possibly to speak, but unfortunately she can't do it. And okay, I'll try to present what I can. And actually, I would agree with Ilya generally that we are moving towards possibly more dangerous situation, and the war in Ukraine could be kind of beginning of some maybe more dangerous and more violent, more bloody conflict. Of course, at the moment for us, I'm a Ukrainian. Yeah, I was born in Ukraine, spent almost all my life in Ukraine, and I've been in Ukraine first months of the war. I just arrived a week ago from Ukraine to Poland. I'm at the moment in Krakow. But yeah, I witnessed the situation in Kiev, in Lviv, in Odessa. I traveled during the war a little bit. And yes, so I will speak about Ukraine first. And the situation in Ukraine is strange. Yeah, for some reason, the life could look normal in cities like Lviv or like in Odessa or in Kiev. Yeah, you have this air defense alarms. You have some fighting not far from the cities. Sometimes you can hear the shelling, but yeah, so it looks like normal. But in fact, economy is in very bad situation. Yeah, around 40% of Ukrainian GDP is actually export of grains, export of iron ore, a little bit fertilizers, but mostly it is the export that was conducted through the Black Sea ports. It's export of grain, export of iron ore, and all these concentrates, and it's almost halted. Yeah, so some part of this export is now organized through the Danube ports in Romania. Partially, some of the iron ore export is redirected through the railway, through the Poland and Eastern Europe. But generally, it is very, very hardly affected. And Ukrainian economy couldn't last long in such a situation where the Black Sea is blocked and the significant part of the southern Ukraine is occupied, and this is the regions of most effective agriculture. Yeah, the Kherson region, the south of Zaporizhia region. It's the most fertile lands, black soils, and it is true that possibly it will be hardly any significant production of grain in these regions, because the fighting is going on exactly in these regions at the moment, yeah, as we speak. So Ukrainian economy is very heavily affected, and the sustainability of Ukrainian war effort depends very much on the American and European, or generally speaking, the Western aid. Yeah, and at the moment, yeah. So this war at the moment is the national liberation war of Ukrainian people against the foreign invasion, and it is just war, and it was probably no choice for Ukrainians than to fight. Yeah, it was a question of of Putin denying the existence of Ukrainian people, the question of some basic dignity, and you can't speak about any social rights and any human dignity if you are just denying these things. But and the Ukrainian state show it was sustainable to fight, yeah, to protect itself at the first stage of war. The help was very limited, and the Ukrainian state proved it is effective enough to fight, yeah, and to preserve itself. But now we see that Ukraine is more and more dependent from the American help, yeah, and the Ukrainian economy is weaker and weaker, and the longer the war will last, the more Ukraine will be dependent on the policies of the Western partners. So unfortunately, if Ukraine will not win soon, and if we will not see any kind of victory of Ukraine and peace in short term, probably in long term it will be more and more involved in some inter-imperialist conflicts, and the development of these inter-imperialist conflicts can lead to really to situation which is similar to the First World War of 1914, unfortunately. And so in this sense, I'm very pessimistic actually about the general direction of events. This is why we are advocating the help to Ukraine and the abolition of the Ukrainian debt, as this debt is one of the main leverages the Western powers are trying to control Ukraine and manage what we should do and what we should not. Yeah, maybe I speak too long, so I will be happy to participate and answer question later.
Thank you so much, Zakhar. That was very helpful, and we really look forward to taking up some of the themes that you've laid out. It's my pleasure now to introduce Rebecca Karl, and just a reminder, a plug for Rebecca's book that I mentioned earlier, China's Revolutions in the Modern World, A Brief Interpretive History, really is one of the go-to texts right now for anyone trying to understand the history of that situates China where it is in the world order today. Rebecca.
Thank you for that plug. It's a book that I'm pretty excited about and have been excited about since it came out. Let me first thank the organizers for putting this panel together, and particularly Zach Levinson of Spectre Journal, who asked me to join it. Then let me quickly turn to curse the organizers, and particularly Zach, for asking me to join, because I'm no expert on any issue having to do with Ukraine or Russia. And so I've listened very closely to what Ilya and Zakhar have to say, and my own thoughts that I threw together for this panel are very derivative of other people's insights who are closer to being able to produce critical analyses of the particular version of imperialist global violence we're now witnessing in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, I can't speak to the specificity that is Ukraine and Russia at this current conjuncture, although I'm quite convinced that we need to think the moment globally and conjuncturally, as both Ilya and Zakhar have indicated. I am, in addition, and this speaks to the corner of the world that I inhabit or pay a lot of attention to, I'm rather unpersuaded that the equations made between the Ukraine and Taiwan, Russia and China are in any way comparatives that shed a lot of light on anything specific. Although, of course, all are involved in the global conjunctural moment and conjunctural crisis of which we must speak. I'm aware, as Brian Ho and Wen Liu in Spectre recently wrote, that the slogan Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow, as Brian and Wen Liu both have said, has been adopted in Taiwan by both the pro-unification and pro-independence camps to express the urgency of war, and that this slogan is taken from a previous slogan, which was Hong Kong today, Taiwan tomorrow. So I'm aware that in Taiwan, there's a sense of doom and gloom around how the PRC is squashing Hong Kong and might come to squash Taiwan, and how the discourse of the war and its prosecution could possibly spill over. It still seems to me that the rush to equivalence is quite problematic. And of course, the resonating nationalistic chauvinisms, nativisms, and populisms are concerning and worth noting. And yet these have been present and have been growing in Russia, China, and Ukraine, and Taiwan and elsewhere for some time. So there are elements in all of these places that have played on these various political positions. So to address at the outset the wing of commentary quite popular in the US these days, it appears that the Ukraine equals Taiwan version of global analysis of Russia's war has found great support in the inner precincts of the US security state, and particularly of the zombie US Cold War diplomatic establishment, which ever since 1949 has wished to reverse the results of the Chinese Revolution. However, now that the Chinese communists are as capitalist as anyone else, and now that the long ongoing trend in the US domestically is very clearly consolidating around firmly anti-democratic processes to secure the rule of misogynistic white supremacy, the desired and ever deferred war between a democratic Taiwan and a communist China has few convincing Cold War ideological legs to stand on. And so it seems to me that these are the ways in which these American commentators, and I call them zombie commentators because they're dead and undead at the same time. I mean, they just are constantly coming back to really, really old forms of discourse. But I think that at this point, these are false flag operations that should be recognized and exposed. Even as we also must resist romanticizing the PRC state as the only entity that stands between US imperialism and global socialism. These are all very false choices. They merely serve to obscure rather than clarify. And yet, contra to the liberal belief that somehow superior factuality will set us all free, I don't think that correcting the record is sufficient for critical analysis, as all sides are rendering pasts into fantastical histories based on fudged facts and willed silences. As Mao Zedong never tired of pointing out, facts are not neutral. All claims to facticity are political, or that is ideological the ideological acts. So it's not my position that these mainstream analyses don't have consequences. They do. Of course they do. The military, petro-industrial capitalist complexes that fuel and undergird our global economy ensure that these consequences are always deadly, violent, and distributed unevenly across the globe and among different populations. But these commentaries, I would say, can't really form the basis of our critical energies, lest we be trapped in their encompassing agendas, which can only be the reassertion of certain forms of capitalist hegemony over other and competing forms of capitalist imperialisms. And we're not on any of those sides, it seems to me. So maybe we can think about the problem of what I've called the comprador bourgeoisie as a global class. This is something that in a recent commentary, Slavoj Žižek has called a lumpen bourgeoisie. But I prefer my category to his because in my telling, all capitalism is compradorized from the very beginning. That is, following the mid-20th century Chinese philosopher Wang Yanan, his intervention, we have to see the comprador as more than an accidental domestic figure of abjection, but rather as a necessary figure in and of the unevenness of global capitalism in its inevitably imperialist and modern forms. And so what I want to suggest by seeing that the war and the current capitalist conjuncture as an opportunity for the reformation of comprador capitalism and the comprador bourgeoisie as a global class is to think about how this modern world of global capital and its imperialist and colonial formations has to be understood as a way of, as a mode of thinking the reproduction on a world scale of capitalism as a global form in its encounters with the concreteness of life in particular places in the world. And it seems that what Zakhar told us about the impact on the global economy, on the Ukrainian economy, and the ways in which, and Ilya talking about the ways in which these dependencies now are being baked into a new global economic formation, it seems to me that the comprador, who was born of imperialist capitalism in the metropoles and the colonies simultaneously, has continued his life as a facilitator of the depredation of human and natural life the world over. And he is almost inevitably a he, okay? Let's be clear, it is almost inevitably a masculine position. And so the point here is to recognize that national level analyses that hold out the promise of Ukraine, the world being saved by this or that political or economic leader, Biden, Zelensky, Putin, Xi, or the CEOs of corporate power, ignore the subnational and supranational forces at play in this conjuncture. And that's not to negate the need, as Zakhar eloquently spoke to, for resistance, because it absolutely requires, there is no real choice. I mean, the resistance has to continue. But I think that it's correct to point out that this war, like most modern wars, is precipitated by an capitalist crisis. And however you think this crisis, and some people have thought it as the end of neoliberalism, others have thought about it as the deepening or the expansion or the extension of neoliberalism. But however one thinks it, we can observe that situated supranationally are the global compradors who will profit and benefit from each and every capitalist crisis, equally those that they themselves cause, such as the 2008 financial collapse, and those that happen to them as if by accident, such as either the pandemic or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, among other current contenders. We need to recall, that is, that during the Asian financial crisis of 1990, what I wanted to say is that we're calling them oligarchs now. We're calling, those who operate in this mode oligarchs. And this recalls to me the moment in 1997 during the Asian financial crisis when the category of crony capitalist was invented as a supposedly specific type who was culturally Asian and thus accused of being dependent on the state for his capitalist practice. This croniness became an all-purpose excuse used by supposed non-cronies not located in Asia to force unworthy Asian countries into bankruptcy, and thus castigating Russian and Asian capitalists as cronies or oligarchs, as therefore culturally deficient capitalists, ideologically facilitates, in the US at least, the exploitative profiteering U.S. capitalists and the U.S. Bourgeoisie in all of the ways it will. And so there remains then, and I'll just end with this, the matter of China's apparent support for Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, because it sits slightly uneasily in what we might understand to be Russia's desire to perpetuate a global economy. Now, we know that WeChat accounts in and outside China that express support for Ukrainian resistance or doubt about Russian motives have been censored and embargoed. Those responsible for such postings who reside in China are under state surveillance or by now in police custody. So it is impossible really to know how widespread or deep such pro-Ukraine or anti-Russia or anti-Chinese state sentiment actually is amongst the Chinese population. By the same token, what the US and Western European media report about China's support for Putin is uniformly alarmist, incendiary, and intended, it seems, to threaten and discipline China into line. This can't work, and conversely, it appears to have helped China harden its rhetorical defense of Russia and to have the consequences that Ilya was sketching out before. China will never toe a line set down by the United States and its NATO allies, and nor can China be induced to accept a further expansion of US NATO bases and interests on its perimeters. Indeed, as Brian Hyo and Wen Liu observe in their Spectre article, China's support for Russia, quote, frames the invasion of Ukraine as a justified response to Western aggression, unquote. And yet China is also, rhetorically at least, a great supporter of what is called globalization, or that is the endless expansion of capitalist relations and forms as a function of the accumulation of use values needed to fuel China's ever-expanding economy and to keep social relations subordinated but stable within the country. How a prolonged war occasioned by Russia's invasion of Ukraine fits that agenda, I don't know, and I think that is yet to be seen. So I'll just end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I can tell that people listening and watching are being stimulated. We've got a couple of comments in the chat, one of which is just a nice commendation of the presentations and discussion. There is a specific question to Rebecca that I'll invite everybody to really come in on if they would like. And it goes back, Ilya, to your term blockification, where you were describing an increased fragmentation and fracturing of the global economy. And Tani Barlow was really asking Rebecca to discuss that concept in terms of her analytical framework. But I think I'll ask all three of you to really come in and elaborate on this point, because what all of you are describing in different ways is an analysis of the war in Ukraine as a product of, in the first instance, the fracturing of the global economy, perhaps since the 2008-9 crisis, but also as intensifying that fracturing. So Ilya, maybe you could start by just kind of elaborating a little bit on that. Zakhar, if you would like to say anything about how that's experienced at the level of social and economic life in Ukraine. And then Rebecca, if you would like to come back to the question of, even if that's not the term you used, how that analysis of fracturing does fit with what you were describing. So Ilya, let's start with you.
Right. So my idea was pretty simple, that the world is dividing into political blocks, and economic activity will be located within these political blocks. So trade between the blocks will reduce, and more trade will happen within those political economic blocks. And so globalization is replaced with this division of the world into several huge regions, you could say. So probably this will not happen, first of all, immediately. This will take many years, maybe decades. But I think this is the general direction of where the world is going. And the primary driver is this fracturing relationship between America and China, because I think the whole sort of axis of globalization hinged on this relationship between two biggest economies in the world. And if this relationship deteriorates, then all economic relationships between politically unfriendly countries deteriorate. And so I think it's almost an official American policy now to try to avoid economic integration with countries that are unfriendly. And in fact, at least half of the world will be unfriendly if you look at it like this. So China is unfriendly, Russia is unfriendly, Iran is unfriendly. So a lot of countries are unfriendly, and those unfriendly countries will join together probably. In fact, Iran also is willing to increase its cooperation with Russia. Now Iranian officials want to come to Russia, and talk about sort of creating this new axis of evil with China, Russia, Iran. So this is the direction, and Syria, of course, where Putin helped Assad to stay in power. So this is, I think, where the world is going. And then we saw that capital is in fact capable of huge losses if there is political pressure, because companies are truly leaving Russia right now. Western companies are truly leaving Russia and leaving behind billions of dollars and even tens of billions of dollars of investments. So in fact, the value of Western investments in Russia is much bigger than the value of the reserves that were frozen right now, Russian reserves that were frozen. So in that sense, it is quite curious that capitalists, in fact, they follow this geopolitical logic. So a lot of people expected that there will be no such dramatic, break in this economic relationship between Russia and the West. But then we see that those transnational companies, they are truly leaving Russia, leaving behind their investments, their products, their brands, everything. And this is an indication that sometimes geopolitics is more powerful than the economy. So.
Thank you, Ilya. Zakhar, any thoughts that you would like to add on this?
Yes, I have some thoughts. I would say that, during the last years, I witnessed many things that I previously thought is just impossible. Yeah. In terms of economics, also the economical development of Ukraine is very strange, and you can't explain it in some economical terms. Yeah, in some economical logic. Yeah, Ukraine, in Soviet times, Ukraine was very heavily integrated into the Soviet economical space. Yeah, and Ukraine was, and still to some extent is, a big industrial country, with many very different industries, aircraft building, ship building, all this machine building, and of course, nuclear power plants, all the stuff. Yeah, and it was very integrated with Russia. In just 8 years ago, in 2013, for example, the half of export of Ukraine was to Russia and half to European Union. Yeah, so Ukraine was on the approximately in equal stage integrated in both with Europe and with Russia and all this Russian customs union led by Russia. And it was impossible just to imagine that Ukraine can totally cancel, close all the economical ties with Russia. But this is what is happening now. Yeah, so it's almost done. Yeah, we have even before the war, it was even no normal transport connection. Yeah, no trains running to Russia, no airplanes flying, and this is between big countries, which very strong ties. Yeah, many Ukrainians have family members in Russia. Many Russians have family members in Ukraine. It's some dozens of millions of people, that just appeared over some iron curtain between each other. And this is really, maybe this is how the world will look like, not only in Ukraine soon, I would say. So this is kind of experiment that, unfortunately, at the moment you can't imagine, that America and China will somehow stop trade relations. It's just impossible. Yeah, but who knows? Who knows what we will have in the coming decade, though. So.
Thank you, Zakhar. Rebecca, over to you on blockification.
Well, it's the first I've heard that word, so thank you, Ilya, for the new concept for me. I'll think more on it, but I think that I think there's no doubt that sanctions as levied by nation states against one another are in fact fracturing, but they are also an opportunity for a supranational capitalist class, which I'm calling the comprador class, to reconstitute themselves outside of nation states. And so I think that in this sense, Ilya's final point, which was that in his presentation, was about the return to 1914, and I think in this sense, interestingly, I get to that return slightly differently, but in the original sort of contradiction that is set up between an expansive capitalism that is globalizing and national boundaries that try to contain it. And this is, an old theoretical and historical problem that, Lenin and others, of course, decided was made into a central aspect of their discussion of imperialism and the causes for the First World War. But it seems to me that we're not going to see this exactly play out in the same way as 1914 and after. But it seems to me we are setting up here, the sanction regime is setting up the possibility and the potential for the formation of a non-national, supranational capitalist form of accumulation, circulation, and exchange that will somehow find a way through these losses and so on that are temporarily setbacks and that may wipe out certain of the corporations and so on, but is certainly not going to wipe out capitalism. So I think that we have to be attuned to the ways in which the forms of accumulation, exchange, and circulation will necessarily change, but or will necessarily have, but we have to be attentive to them in supra and subnational ways rather than only in national state ways. I think that we really have to, if we're going to get at the crux, I think, of what's going to happen, if we continue only to look at the nation state, and obviously in wars that are one nation state invades another one, of course, our unit of analysis has to include the nation state. But I think if we rest there alone, we need to think about supra and subnational forms, and the subnational forms being the ones that can do transnational solidarities from below, and the supranational ones who do transnationalism as global capitalism. So I don't know if that was particularly coherent, but I just want to try to think beyond the nation state or through and out the other side, because I think that this may be a moment at which we can start to grasp what's at stake here for capitalism and for imperialism and for the ways in which nation states are operating. I don't know. Just a provocation. Don't know if that's true.
Thank you, Rebecca. A couple more questions have come in. Before I turn fully to them, I wanted to make sure that we didn't neglect something that Zakhar, you raised in your presentation, and just get the take of all three speakers on this, because one of the things I've noticed in a lot of left commentary is that there's a tendency in a lot of quarters to want to be one-dimensional. Whereas, Rebecca, I think you were calling on us to be multidimensional in the analysis. And what I mean by that is, Zakhar, you said to us that at one level, and I fully, wholeheartedly agree with you on this, that at one level, the struggle of the people of the Ukraine right now against the Russian invasion is a national liberation struggle. And you said at the same time, that national liberation struggle is interacting with an inter-imperial set of conflicts. And it seems to me that a lot of analysis on the left has wanted to just take one of those dimensions. Either only the first is true, and you then ignore the inter-imperial dimension, or it's only inter-imperial, and then you ignore the legitimate right to self-defense of the people of Ukraine. And it seems to me that all three of you in different ways were insisting that we need to see all of these dimensions, that it is a multidimensional moment in terms of both the military conflict, but also in terms of developments in the world economy. So perhaps I'll just ask each of you in the same order in which we went, Ilya, starting with you, to sort of come back on that issue.
Right. So I think it's not actually a simple question, because it is true from a descriptive standpoint that there is a war of national liberation, and I completely agree with Zakhar's formulation, and I am deeply ashamed and I'm just destroyed by the fact that my country is launching this war of aggression and Ukraine is defending itself. And then there is an inter-imperialist conflict. But the question is how to move from this declaration to some kind of demand, some kind of normative vision. So what does it mean exactly? Because unfortunately, when I read those articles that mention this inter-imperialist rivalry, often it comes down to the fact that maybe Russia is not ultimately responsible. Maybe Ukraine is maybe the West is responsible. Maybe America, NATO is responsible. So it's to me it's a question: how do you produce an analysis that pays attention to these contradictions between imperialist powers, but at the same time there is no denying Russia's culpability and Russia's, that Russia in fact started this war, launched this invasion, and it is Russian imperialism that is at the center of this problem. So to me, this is just a question how to do this kind of analysis. I'm still trying to do it properly.
Thank you, Ilya. Zakhar.
Yes, thank you for stressing this point. It is really, it's kind of one of the most disappointing things for me. I'm of course a person of left outlook, yeah, and I appreciate very much international solidarity and was very sympathetic for many left people in the United States and in Europe. And unfortunately, I was very disappointed when I understand that people are, just making some geopolitical analysis of some inter-imperialist rivalry, yes, of some conflicts between different imperialisms. Well, maybe it is even true. Yeah, almost of the things they are writing are almost, but it is not about any kind of struggle for just vote and nothing to do with any social justice. Yeah, it's just some everybody can possibly Russian and Western imperialists also do some kind of analysis how they can fight each other. And yeah, for me, I think that if we are opposing this system, global system of imperialism, global system of big powers suppressing other peoples of the world, we should support these national liberation things. We should support any kind of anti-imperialism fight. And this is for me, this is the first step to somehow challenge the system of imperialism, because otherwise, if you are just saying this is kind of anti-imperialist war, one imperialism is responsible, but other is also responsible, and so what? So what? What is the recipe? What actually, the people are dying. Yes, the millions of people are refugees. The thousands are dying as we speak, and we are just talking that about maybe we should somehow share responsibility between imperialism and so on. And this is unacceptable for me. We should challenge the imperialist system, not try to somehow polish it to be a little bit not that violent and not that bloody as it is. This is what I can say.
Thank you, Zakhar. And Rebecca, any further thoughts?
No, I mean, I think you posed the question. I think Ilya and Zakhar being closer to the problem are in sort of elemental ways can speak to it more clearly. I mean, obviously, the question of how to center Russian imperialism and its opportunistic invasion of Ukraine, but still do a multidimensional analysis that situates it in a larger context that doesn't take the pressure off of the analysis of the central analysis of Russia and Ukraine, but that situates it more globally or more in a larger context, both historically and so on. I think this is an important problem, and it's one that the left in the United States, at least, has been seriously dismal at doing. I mean, if Zakhar, if Ilya, you are ashamed, and Zakhar, you are disappointed. I'm just, I don't know what I am. I'm just incredibly. Disappointment doesn't even really quite say what I am about the position of the left. And, we've been fighting this battle now. I mean, some of us, the critical China scholars, have been fighting this battle against those who basically think that China continues to be a defender of socialism in the world, and whatever China does is, by definition, therefore socialist, and therefore now if China defends Russia, then Russia must be doing the right thing. I mean, this is a position that has been, really, really difficult to dismantle amongst those who are legitimately as am I, anti-imperialist, anti-US imperialist. And so, it doesn't seem to me very hard to hold both positions at the same time, that one can be anti-US imperialism and anti-state settler Chinese state settler colonialism and anti-Russian imperialist. It seems to me possible and in fact consistent to hold all of these positions at the same time. But somehow there's a reductionist tendency in the left to say, if you don't support the Chinese state, then therefore you support U.S. imperialism. If you, and so on, these binaries that become impossible. Sort of, those are what I would call real blockifications of thinking. Those are real. So I think it's an important project to think these questions in larger terms without losing sight of the fact, as Zakhar very clearly reminds us, there are people dying, and that would and that there are millions, and people are being rendered into refugees by the millions, all the time. And this, of course, isn't just happening in Ukraine, but we're talking about the Ukraine. Yeah.
Thank you, Rebecca. The comments section has gotten quite active, so I'm going to kind of group two together. And really, I think each of you should just feel free to reply to whatever you feel inspired to in these comments. Rob Hoveman asks whether the trend towards blockification has its origins in the perceived rise of China as a threat to post-Cold War US hegemony, rather than as a result of the 2008 financial crisis per se. So it's really a question about where do the origins of the increasing conflict between the US and China lie, and of course maybe it's something of both. Jessica Copley has a couple of comments really around the theme of that quite often US imperialist wars can be seen as fundamentally about resource extraction and the building of geopolitical force, for instance, strategic nodes for military bases, whereas it appears to Jessica that perhaps Putin is really focused on territorial gains as opposed to resource extraction, military bases, and the like. So again, let's just go in the order in which we started, and if you prefer just to focus your responses on one of those two, feel free to do it that way. Ilya.
Right. So, first of all, I must say that I did not know that the word blockification exists, but a person mentioned it on Twitter in response to some of my articles, and I thought that it's a nice, term. So apparently, you can turn this into a word. So since then, I started to use it. So I did not coin it. In fact, would be difficult for me to coin a new term because I'm not a native English speaker. Some
of the best concepts come from not English, so please.
Perhaps. So, in terms of this trend towards blockification, I read this very interesting book by Michael Pettis. It's called "Trade Wars Are Class Wars," and this actually inspired me to come up with this general idea that the relationship between America and China is deteriorating. And the explanation in this book is that the logic of trade between America and China was that China is selling a lot of goods and America is paying in dollars. And then China stores these dollars in American public debt. and so America wins twice from this relationship, from cheap products and also from credits that essentially China provides credits to America to consume those products. So it seems that this relationship is very profitable to the United States, but apparently this trade deficit that America has with China is unsustainable, and the political class in America decided that this type of relationship will be detrimental to America in the long term, as I understand the argument. And this is the origin of this problem. And then the interesting thing is that how does Russia come into this picture? Because unlike America and China, Russia is not a strong economic player, like I said. So Russia has, in fact, nothing to offer to the world, maybe oil and natural gas, but even that is replaceable. In fact, oil is definitely replaceable because the trade routes can be redirected, from Middle Eastern countries. So Russian oil is replaceable in the world. But at the same time, Russia is a military power. And until the war in Ukraine, everyone thought that Russia has the second best army in the world. Now it's very questionable. So the performance of Russian army was not great, and but still, the military was the only real strength that Russia has. And I see that Russia came into this emerging inter-imperialist problem between America and China and brought the only thing that it had, the military that it used against Ukraine. And then, of course, the United States is, helping Ukraine. And so it's a sort of combination of economic changes between America and China and the military factor brought by Russia. This is, I think, how we should broadly understand, what's going on in the world right now.
Zakhar.
Well, I'm sorry. I didn't really. Can you once again say what questions are you think I should comment? Because it's too many different things, and well.
Fair enough. There's a lot going on in the comments, and I was trying to get a couple in at the same time, and that probably did not help the cause. One of the questions, and Zakhar, this is probably one that is particularly relevant to you. Jessica is really raising the question as to whether this is just purely about territory for Putin, or are there other kinds of what Jessica is suggesting are more conventional US imperialist type motivations, resources, and strategic military bases. So, how do you see it?
Yes, I can ask.
Engage in that regard.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. Ukraine was, of course, a subordinated part of Russian Empire. Yeah, and but it was always, the second important part of Russian Empire. Yeah, the Ukrainians always play a significant role, actually, in the managing of this empire. Maybe you can compare it with the role of Scotland in Britain. Yeah, there was many industry in Scotland, and Ukrainian military industrial complex was a very significant part of Soviet military industrial. And during the World War II, the 1/3 of Red Army was originated on Ukraine, and the main factories producing tanks, and this famous T-34 tank, it was produced and designed in Kharkiv, and the Russian facilities for building tanks, the famous Ural Vagon Zavod, was built actually by Ukrainians evacuated from Kharkiv. Yeah. And of course, kind of rebuilding of Russian empire is impossible without Ukraine. Russia has some money, has some economical power because of exporting these resources, and has some scientific and technological potential. But it's definitely not enough. I'm not sure if it will be enough if Ukraine will be subordinated to Russia, but Ukrainian potential is also very significant. So it's of course not just the classical colonial relationships when one country is just trying to capture some source of some basic resources. Yes, so not only Ukrainian grain or Ukrainian iron ore is important for Russia, but Ukrainian military industries, Ukrainian engineers, all kind of Ukrainian scientific institutions and factories that can produce big ships, big airplanes, and airplane engines, and air carriers in Nikolaev, the city that is now on the front line. The Nikolaev, it's the biggest Soviet factory for producing these air carriers. So this is fight not just for resources, but for subordinating kind of significant part of industry and scientific and technological potential of Ukraine.
Can I add a few points? Because I think it's a really interesting question. So the question of territory. And I agree with Zakhar that potentially Ukraine could be like a big prize for Putin, because Ukraine would represent a strengthening of this common, it's called Eurasian Economic Union. So if only Putin was able to entice Ukraine to join this union, then it would be an economic power, and there will be economic benefits, there will be geopolitical benefits, and so on. But Ukraine proved time and again that it is unwilling to join any kind of bloc with Russia, especially in this with this authoritarian Russia, with imperial authoritarian nationalistic Russia. And so at the current stage of the war, when Russia failed to conquer Kiev, Russia failed to achieve its crazy goals of the first phase of the war, as the Kremlin calls it. Now it's really degenerated into this question of territory. The only thing that Russia wants from Ukraine, apparently, is just territorial conquest. So now it's focused on Donbass, but then Russian military also talked about building some kind of land corridor to Transnistria, to Romania. So now it's only about territory. So it's no longer about the economy, because the war itself simply destroys all productive assets in Donbass, for instance. All those factories, Azovstal, for instance, was a huge steel factory, a gigantic, production center, and now it's just completely razed to the ground. So the war itself nullifies all economic motives. It's simply the conquest of territory, even without the people, because Ukrainians on the occupied territories, they flee to territories still under the control of Ukraine. And so now what Russia wants, seemingly, is just to conquer as much of Ukraine as it can, which is a completely crazy approach. So it is unjustifiable on any level. So why should, for instance, Kherson be part of Russia or be occupied by Russia? What is the logic here? Why Odessa? So what will be logic there? So now it doesn't have any historic background. It doesn't have any even economic rationality. It's just about conquering as much territory as Russia can. So to me, this is just still trying to wrap my head around this, because it's really difficult to understand using the instruments that we have, Marxist instruments. for instance, because a sort of Marxist approach doesn't really work here very well, I think.
I'm going to be able to, I think, get one more theme in, but Rebecca, anything you would like to add on this set of issues?
No, these speak to some really specific issues that I don't have any expertise in. I mean, I think, I would say that in general, Marxist or not Marxist, that territorial expansion and extraction, either of labor power and or of natural resources, generally go together. And yet there seems to be, as Ilya and Zakhar are indicating, an element of sort of just like pure punishment that's happening now. I mean, in terms of territorial expansion, just to punish, to be as punishing as possible, with what long-term gain is unclear. But the razing to the ground of productive resources, we have to, I just want to be very clear here, we have to recall is also the environmental despoliation and what Russia was doing with Chernobyl, what the environmental, long-term environmental catastrophes that are being put in place here, that whoever lives in these territories, whether they are Ukrainians or whomever they ultimately are going to be dealing with long-term environmental catastrophe that is not just localized, and so on. So I don't know that we can think this, in terms of a lot logically right now, because I think there's now, without saying that Russians are irrational because they're Russian, which is a way that Americans also tend to just dismiss, the whole thing is that, Russians or Chinese are just irrational because they're Russian or because they're Chinese. That racist old trope of, only white people are rational, or only Western Europeans, are rational, or Americans or whatever. I think that version of the world exists. And so I would hesitate to use those kinds of, but I agree that this kind of the kind of logic that we use has to be scrambled a little bit. And we have to think about what the nature of, of the rape culture of militaries, which is not explainable by a, strict economic logic, as it were, but is clearly happening. I mean, the gendered sort of modes in which populations are being punished, and women are being punished for being women, for being Ukrainian women stuck in a war zone, and so on. I mean, these are real consequences that we have to think outside of the logics of economics that tend to ground our analyses more generally. I don't have any answers for it, though.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm going to just really briefly acknowledge some of the people who got questions in that we simply were not able to do justice to. By the way, I think that once again reminds us how important discussions and debates on the left like this are, and the importance of what Red May is doing for us. Aaron Jaffe had raised a point around internally displaced migrants and the double standards that are being applied in parts of the West. Steve Lee had wanted to emphasize the importance of opposition to NATO and US imperialism. Creative Experiments had a couple of comments about the brutality of US trade wars. Felix was not persuaded around Russia being imperialist, and so on. There were also a couple of thanks to our speakers in the comments, but I really wanted, in conclusion, to come back to, it was a term that you used, Rebecca, but it was running through all of the discussions, and it was about transnational solidarity from below. Because ultimately, one of the reasons that Spectre wanted to sponsor this panel was to reinvigorate our thinking on the international left about what transnational solidarity ought to look like in this context of imperialism and war. And Zakhar, I think it would be appropriate to start with you as a person who has been on the ground throughout most of the war in Ukraine, and then Ilya and Rebecca, I will let the two of you round it out from there. I'll then have a comment or two before passing things back to Philip.
Thank you, David. Yeah, the war is really kind of very bad thing to witness. And what I witnessed personally, I never been on front lines, but I've been, for example, on the border when the first wave of evacuation from Ukraine was going on, and it was really huge lines of people on the Polish border, and many students from Africa, from Asia, from India, from Kenya, from Nigeria. I saw people from Nigeria, for example. They were waiting much longer than Ukrainians. It was some kind of, division, the people with Ukrainian passport or the people with the passport of European Union were prioritized by the border guards, and of course Ukrainians. It was almost Ukrainian women and children, and international students were mostly young people. In their 20s, but still it was very disturbing for me to see. And yes, I would say that some racism exists in Ukrainian bodyguards, in Ukrainian border guards, and of course I would say that the prioritization of Ukrainian refugee in Europe is some kind of racist thing. So unfortunately, refugees from Syria was not always welcomed as good as Ukrainians, and but I think that the problem is not in Ukrainians, but in the system that should welcome all refugees, not depending of any race or any origin. But of course, Polish people can explain this, that Ukrainians are culturally much more closer to them than some Syrian people, but nevertheless. So we all see the things, it's many. Actually, this war demonstrates to what extent the world is racist around us. Thank you.
Thank you, Zakhar, and thank you for reminding all of us that global solidarity means anti-racism and migrant justice. Ilya, over to you.
Right. I would also share a sort of personal anecdote because I have also left Russia. So I'm outside Russia right now because, It's dangerous for any kind of activism and any kind of public expression of the rejection of the war. It's anything can send you to prison. So it's basically unannounced martial law in Russia. And so I had to leave because I want to continue speaking out in Russian and in English, trying to express my disagreement with what's going on. And so in this new sort of political immigration in the countries that become like a new home for people who leave Russia, I see two tendencies. And one tendency is that everyone is trying to shame each other. These new migrants, you are not doing enough. You are doing so. You're not anti-Russian enough. You're not anti-Putin enough. You're not anti-imperialist enough, and so on. Right? Especially, we should be mindful of the fact that most of the people who are leaving Russia now for political reasons, they're liberals. They're not leftists. And liberals are in fact a tough crowd in Russia. I would say they're difficult to deal with. So they bring this sort of moralistic friendly fire, you could say, to everything. It's one tendency. And another tendency is the opposite. So there is another group of people who leave Russia. They do not want to be political. They just want to forget everything, to settle in a new country, to, especially if they are able to do this because they work in IT, they're software engineers and stuff like this. So they find new jobs and they somehow settle in these new places, and they just don't want to talk politics at all. They don't want to be reminded of what's going on. And what I found is that both things are extremely unhelpful. So what I think we need to do as political immigrants, unfortunately, we're that at the moment. So we don't need to shame each other all the time, because it's just unproductive. It doesn't work ultimately. But on the other hand, we should not forget about what's going on. We should not pretend that the war is not happening still. So I think the solidarity, I'm talking this narrow understanding of solidarity as solidarity between people who left Russia, right? So there should be a sort of practical solidarity, that people should continue to discuss what's going on. They should try to stage protests in countries, outside Russia. They should try to help Ukrainian refugees and launch new media projects in order to inform people within Russia, because this is possible with the internet still, and try to somehow influence the situation. Even though I understand that as immigrants, it's our ability to influence situation within Russia is very limited, but we still should try to do what we can, without this moralistic outrage and without this pretense of a normal life, that everything is okay and we're just settling in another country and nothing happens in Russia and in Ukraine. Something like this. It's just my thoughts that I decided to share with you, in response to this question.
Thank you, Ilya. Rebecca.
Well, I hate to have I hate to be the person who's speaking last here, because I know the least, but I think that transnational solidarities, of which Ilya speaks and that Zakhar points out, have to be devoid of. I have to get rid of these, sort of racist and other kinds of things. We hear a lot about mercenaries going to join the fight, whether, and that's not the kind of solidarities I'm thinking of. Okay. I'm thinking of the kinds of solidarities that get us through and out the other side of militarism, even as we continue to understand that the military conflict is going to be centered in our analyses and in our practices. But I don't know what to say about transnational solidarity, because we've been thinking about this in terms when we went during the Hong Kong protests. We were thinking it around the incarceration, the mass incarceration of Xinjiang, of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. We've been thinking about it in a number of different ways. How to animate a transnational solidarity from below that moves beyond and through nation states. I don't think I have an answer for it, except that I think that Ilya, you've articulated quite frankly an important point, is that we can't be at each other's throats constantly, because if we are, we just play into an entirely different kind of power game that is not ours, and we shouldn't concede that power to somebody else. But aside from that, I don't have much else to say about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca. And maybe it's also worth reminding ourselves that simply bringing into conversation a left activist from Ukraine, an independent left activist and researcher from Russia, and one of our preeminent critical China scholars is itself a gesture of transnational solidarity. On behalf of Spectre Journal, I really want to thank all three presenters, Rebecca, Zakhar, and Ilya. It's been a wonderful discussion. I thank everyone who engaged in the comment section, as well as those who simply listened in and observed the discussion today. Spectre Journal is very proud to have sponsored this panel and delighted that our three speakers could join us. And then, of course, we are thrilled to continue this collaboration with Red May. Philip, thank you on behalf of all our speakers and of Spectre Journal. And of course, we will give you the last word.
Thanks a lot, David. And reimagining transnational solidarity from below would have been a great panel. You always realized the best panels on the last day of, but next year for sure, we should do something like that. I mean, I guess if you want to reimagine the end of capitalism, that's the thing you have to imagine first. People who have enjoyed this panel would enjoy watching a panel called What Was Neoliberalism with Joshua Clover, Jamie Merchant, Sarah Briette, and Nikhil Pal Singh, because it discusses the notion of blockification that was brought up here, and the parallels between the situation around the First World War, the First Imperial Age, and so forth, and also the not parallels, the things that we don't want to fall into the notion that something is going to happen again exactly the way it happened the first time. It seems that one of the factors that Rebecca brought up about the global comprador class is the notion that the relation of capital to the nation state is much different now than it was in the 1880s or 1890s. And the number of rich capitalists who are basically unwilling to do anything to make the nation state function and are looking about taking citizenships in Hong Kong, in Singapore, or maybe in New Zealand, so they can pursue relative surplus value without having any responsibilities towards the state, makes, I think, the notion of capital pushing the state to increase its glory a little more suspect than it was in the turn of the century, when the partnership was a lot closer. At any rate, that's my humble or not so humble opinion. But I would like to say thank you, everybody, for being with us for this whole month. We do, however, have the possibility of one more event. We're talking to EndNotes. It may or may not come together. So keep a lookout on Red May TV on YouTube. And if you're in Seattle, tomorrow night is the last film of our Miklos Yancho Festival, Electra My Love, at the Beacon Theater. Absolutely stunning director. It's been a great month. I'm going to sleep for about 4 or 5 days now and maybe read a book or something. Enjoyed having all our guests, particularly from all over the world. It's not, there are some compensations for Zoom, or in this case, StreamYard, but we're looking next year to do a hybrid festival, to go back to a live festival, which of course we will tape and broadcast. We will need money to put it together. So if you've liked what we've done and want to see more of this, go to www.redmayseattle.org and give what you can. We depend on the kindness of strangers like Branch Dubois. And we are like Blanche Dubois, I should say. We're not depending on Blanche Dubois. But please give as you can to our Patreon or our GoFundMe, Fan the Flames of Red May. Thank you once again, Ilya, Zakhar, Rebecca, and David. It was a great discussion. And best of luck to everybody, particularly those of you in difficult situations now. Bye-bye from Red May.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.